Today is April the 16th, and I am Jack Clark, the interviewer of MaxWahl in San Francisco. Charlene Nason is with me today as the second interviewer, and I would like to introduce Max. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, Max?
All right. I'm Max Wahl. I was born April 24th, 1910, in Wuppertal-Barmen in Rhine province of Germany. My parents were Ernst, E-R-N-S-T, and Bertha Wahl. My father was born 1873. My mother was born 1882. There were three sons. My older brother, Karl Hermann, and my younger brother, Hans Rudolf. Karl Hermann was his birth name. In this country, he called himself Charles Wahl. My younger brother calls himself John Wahl. Charles Wahl passed away about 2.5 years ago. John Wahl, who is 3 years younger than I am, resides at the Jewish Home for the Aged at Silver Avenue in San Francisco. I am married to my wife Marion, geborene Auerbach. We were married on November 1st, 1940, in Tangier, North Africa. We just had our golden wedding anniversary. My parents were long-time residents of Barmen. My great-great-grandfather founded my father's business, which was called S&R Wahl. Which meant Saul and Raphael Wahl. Those two brothers probably came originally with the Napoleonic troops from the Alsace to the, at that time, small town of Barmen, and started a dry goods store. Through my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father took the business over, I think, in the beginning of the century. They became one of the leading dry goods stores in the region. My father employed in 1929 between 300 and 350 employees. They carried high-class merchandise, went to Paris for the high fashions. As a very young man, I a few times were allowed to accompany him to see the courtier houses and so on. My mother was Aînée Baccarat from Wiesbaden. Her father also had a dry goods store, which also had been in the family quite a while. Her family tree goes farther back than ours, at least to the end of the 18th century. Um, that is as far as my direct background is concerned. My parents, at the time of my birth, lived in a rather modest home in a nice neighborhood. When the First World War broke out, right across the street, a munition factory was built. So my father felt that with his small children and also with his, all right, being very well-to-do, that he wanted to move. And I bought in about 1920 a very large house which had over 25 rooms, 3 stories high. Where we grew up. So I have to say that I was born not with a silver spoon, but maybe with a golden spoon. The idea that my father hadn't prepared for the future of his family was preposterous. Everything was fine and dandy. My father was very prominent in all civic affairs. I just now got a letter from the mayor of our hometown that they want to put a path in the park in memory of my father. And but they refuse to mention in the plaques they're going to put there the way he died. To put that just in parentheses, my parents died in camp. They were deported in 1943 to Terezin Ghetto. My father died in 43, as far as we know, in Terezin Ghetto of pneumonia. At that time he was 70 years old. My mother then lost her mind and was sent to Auschwitz and died in one of the ovens. To come back to myself, I had a very easy use. I went for 3 years to prep school, or however you call that in this country, before I, at the age of 9, entered the Real Gymnasium, which is like a high school. And I remained in school up to my 16th year, when instead of taking the Abiturium, I decided to go into business and to prepare myself to become the successor or partner of my father. The amount of Jewish boys in my school was very minimal. The Jewish population of Barmen was about 700 persons of a population of roughly 200,000. My parents were Jewish, both Jewish, felt Jewish, but were very liberal. My grandfather had founded or paid for the synagogue, and when I was 13, I was, like all boys, bar mitzvah. But we were not very active as far as Jewish life is concerned, as Jewish religious life is concerned. My father, and probably also myself, we felt German without forgetting that we were Jews. To come back to my own life, in 1926, I went to Cologne as an apprentice in a department store called Michel and Company in Germany. Anybody has to form an apprenticeship, or had, but I believe still today.
I'll give you a little cue when we can go.
At Michel and Company, I was what you call an apprentice. I started to sweep the floor, to fill the stockroom, and it was also a large department store, I would say 500-600 employees. And I left there end of 1928. After that, I went for a year as a young salesman to the KaDeWe in Berlin. It was one of the largest department stores, I would say, in Europe. It still is today. Then in beginning of 1930, I went theoretically for 6 months to Lyon, France, to learn the silk trade. After about 4 months, I got very sick with typhoid fever and laid in hospital for 2 or 3 months. At that time, there were no vaccines. Each time you had a high fever, the nuns, who were the sisters, dunked you into a cold tub of water. But apparently I survived. I then went back to my father's business, and from 1931 on, I was then 21 years old, I started to be the young son of the owner, first with smaller tasks, what at that time was done a lot, greeting the customers, listening to complaints, later on starting to do a little bit buying. So in 1931 and beginning of 32, everything still looked rosy. In 32, as we all know, Hitler became more powerful, became more vociferous, and my father's business started to suffer very much. The clientele we had catered to for decades were the rich bourgeoisie who, while there were no credit cards at that time, paid monthly or bi-monthly. So one of the many suggestions of Hitler was, do damage to the Jews, don't pay your bills. Now this is all in 32. In 33, the financial situation of my father's business became rather precarious. And end of 33, he was forced to go into not bankruptcy, but what we call today Chapter 7 or Chapter 11, in the hope at that time there was already the movement to Aryize businesses. That means to find a partner who was non-Jewish so that it was not more a Jewish business. Despite all efforts, my father was not successful in that, and the business was liquidated beginning of 34 and had a final sale in April, May of 34. Can we stop for a moment?
I'll give you cue. 5 seconds.
As part of my story, I would like to mention that during this total sale, while it was not allowed anymore to have Jewish employees, it was a year and a half after Hitler came to power, one of the conditions which my father had made was that for this sale, unemployed Jewish girls could help as sales girls. And as fate did give it, that is the way I mentioned my wife. And somehow it's a great part of my past. We have been together most of the time, not all of the time, as I will mention to you. I should maybe mention that during the years from 32 to beginning of 34, One other difficulty for the firm was that especially the male employees, the younger ones, became violently pro-Hitler and denounced the customers, the old customers who frequented the stores. The story or the history of the boycott movement and so is so well known that I do not want to talk about it too much. There was the first boycott day proclaimed by Hitler on April 1st, 1933. And that was the first time that we brothers, as well as my father, felt that we were in danger, and we fled for a few days from the town and went to houses of relatives in other cities. I myself, between around 33, was naturally shunned by many of my former friends. A few times I was threatened. A few times I felt that it was dangerous to stay at our house, and I spent nights at non-Jewish friends. Fortunately, I never suffered any harm. In 33, 34, my father naturally realized, like most Jews, if not all, that there was no further future for his sons, who were now in their early 20s, to stay in Germany. So my younger brother, John, went already in 1933 to Madrid, Spain, where a brother of my father, Dr. Fritz Wahl, was the correspondent of one of the leading German newspapers, the Frankfurter Zeitung. And he told my father that if he would send his son, that they would try, that he would find a job and that he would stay with them. In 1934, my brother, who was then, he was born 1913, 21 years old, got an offer to purchase a small business, and my uncle, who had part of his money in Spain, and some of his friends, offered to finance this business under the condition that I would also come to Spain and be let's say, a more sensible head of a small business than my brother, who was a very good salesman and a very poor businessman. I went in July of 1934 to San Sebastian, which is on the Spanish Basque coast, and with lawyers and with bankers. So the financial arrangements were made. Everybody made arrangements what to do with the profits. Nobody ever made any arrangements what would happen if the business would be lost. Anyhow, in September 1934, I left for good by car. I had a little DKW, which is a very small car, to Spain. I mean, I would like to intersperse that before I had been on trips to England with friends from my father, tried other ways to find a new way to make a living. There were all kinds of schemes which never turned out. I was offered, at that time, they still thought in Germany, the representation of all of Germany for Lions T, which was a international. But all these things came to naught, so I ended up in 34 in Spain. We had purchased from a German manufacturer a set of formulas to manufacture shoe polish, floor wax, metal polish. We named the company Productus Salvax. My brother had friends with former German department store people who had opened in Spain a group of stores similar to Woolworths in the United States. And they had promised us that we would get their business to start. Nobody had thought that the climate in Spain is different from the climate in Germany, and that the formulas which were probably good in Germany, in Spain ran out of the boxes. So it took us a couple of years to reformulate things and to start the business on an even keel. My brother John, on a business trip, got very sick in about April 1934 and had to go into a sanatorium in the Spanish Sierra. And in 1936, in June, July, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Due to his health condition, despite the fact that he was Jewish, the German embassy repatriated by plane my brother to Germany. I signed at the German embassy, or consulate, where we had stayed as their guest for a couple of nights, that I refused to go back to Germany despite the urging of the German government. This brought me the honor a few years later that I lost my citizenship, my German citizenship, earlier than most Jews who later on became non-citizens. I still lost my citizenship by name in the German official publication. Nobody naturally knew that the Spanish Civil War, which started as a uprising of the generals, would last 4 years. Everybody thought it would last a week or so, like such revolutions used to take. On July 1st, 2 weeks before the Civil War broke out, I had married my wife in a civil ceremony at the City Hall in Madrid. When the Civil War started, maybe a week after that, we decided that Marion should wait out the end of the unrest with her mother, who was Belgium, and whose husband just had passed away of natural causes of cancer in Germany. And my mother-in-law was at her family in Belgium. So cash was practically unavailable in those revolutionary days, but I got 25 pesetas to give to my wife, and I said, I see you in 2 weeks. We were then separated for over 4 years. Marion couldn't stay, or didn't want to stay in Germany, or couldn't stay in Germany, and moved to France, to Paris, where she hoped from week to week that the Spanish War would end and that she would be able to join me again. I stayed in Madrid. Our small shop, which was at the Avenida Federico Rubio 235 in a suburb of Cuatro Caminos, which is only interesting because it was right, not even a mile, located from the famous Ciudad Universitaria, where a great many of the battles for Madrid were fought. So I was unable to continue even to get to the location. When I sat in Spain, without any means, without any job. I was at that time 25 years old. And basically, even if I had left Germany, I still had felt pretty secure. But then in 1936, when the Civil War prolonged himself, and I found myself all of a sudden without means, with my last 5 pesetas in my pocket. I was desperate. And I was, maybe mistakenly, of the opinion that the Spanish Civil War was not our business, that I was a civilian who started to become a civilian again. So I never involved myself in the Spanish Civil War, contrary to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, to all the other, to the Thielmann Brigade from Germany. I was just a displaced civilian, without money and without knowing what to do. And one day I was wandering the streets and I saw a man at the subway station selling cheese sandwiches, because in Madrid, naturally, there was already a great scarcity of food. And I bought a cheese sandwich and I asked him, where do you get your cheese? Because nobody could get. Oh, he says, I have family in the country. They send me every week so much cheese, and I sell the sandwiches. And out of I got an idea, and I told him, look, you don't have to sell cheese sandwiches anymore. I'm going to buy all the cheese from you. You're going to make more money. And I took those cheeses and sold them to the women, to the refugees, women and children, who were basically either monarchists or phalangists who had taken refuge in the consulates and safe houses and who were in need of food. And frankly, it was a purely unpolitical humanitarian deal, but it also helped me at least to make a living. I went also, these people stayed in these safe houses for years, bored stiff. Some were interested in learning German. I went to the places and gave German lessons. I also helped the Red Cross in evacuations from Madrid to the Mediterranean coast, to Alicante and Valencia. There were always convoys at night to get women and children out of the besieged Madrid.
Could you tell me who ran the safe houses?
Yeah, the safe houses were run by the individual consulates or legacies. As a matter of fact, before middle of 1937, there was an Austrian consulate. Naturally, Austria was an independent state, and for a while I ran one of these safe houses as a man of all trades, running errands, driving the consul. There was always the daily fight to have shelter and food.
Were these run by Gentiles?
There were practically no Jews involved. The Austrian consul, as a matter of fact, Dr. Brunner, I think was Jewish, but basically Spain, since the Inquisition, had no Jewish population. The only Jews were, call them refugees from the Hitler countries, Austria, Germany, Poland, and most of them at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War had left Madrid, had gone to Barcelona, which was closer to the French border, and the Jewish help organizations like Hayas and so had sent a number of my Jewish friends to Argentine, to Buenos Aires, where most of them remained in South America because naturally there was the language problem wasn't there. So while there were, to my knowledge today, Jews in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, in the Tillman Brigade, there was no Jewish community in Madrid till long after the Spanish Civil War. Jewish friends during the Civil War, I don't recall. Yes, one or two, but not anything which you would call a community. In just a second. In October of 1938, I was detained by the Spanish security police because I was German. It's known by today, Germany had involved themselves very actively into the Spanish Civil War. The Legion Condor was the German part of the Spanish army. Italy and Germany subventioned Franco and tried to help him to win the war, while the international brigades from France, from the United States, and from Russia tried to help the legally established Spanish government. To come very briefly back to the Civil War, the idea, the Spanish monarchy in 1934 was overthrown by the Spanish Workers' Union, by the Social Democrats. There was a republic which was not very good to the well-to-do bourgeoisie, nor to the clergy. So in 1936, the opposition had formed a plan to overthrow the elected government, and the leader of this military government was supposed to be a general who was located in Portugal and who was supposed to fly to Madrid to take head of the government. His plane perished, and the only general who was in non-Spanish territory was General Franco, who was the commander of the Spanish troops in Morocco, who in turn had been very friendly with the Jewish population in Morocco. There were very large Jewish population in Spanish Morocco and also in French Morocco, also in the, at that time, free city of Tangier, and at that time the fear of many, not to say all, well-to-do people was that if a revolution would continue, that communism would take over. So these Spanish Moroccan, basically Moroccan, not Spanish, Moroccan bankers financed Franco, which became the regime of Franco. As far as the Jews are concerned, Franco never forgot this. And after Franco became victorious in 1939, and after the difficulties for the Jews in Morocco became greater, he admitted Moroccan Jews as Spanish into Spain. And there was, or still is, Jewish life again in Spain.
Seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a cue.
Now, in this prison I was incarcerated was called the Checker of San Lorenzo. It used to have to be a convent. And I was there. This was an old convent, and there were maybe 100, maybe 150 people detained, not mistreated, just incarcerated, very little food, very little hygiene.
Why were you incarcerated?
I always was incarcerated. I was later incarcerated again because I really didn't have the right passport. You see, I was a German citizen. that didn't make any difference between Jewish or non-Jewish. I was a German, and the Germans were on the other side. And that was at the end of the Spanish Civil War, that means the last 6 months. So the Republicans, or like the enemies would say, the Reds, were desperate, and they detained as many people as they could. Neither did they like the idea that I had helped with evacuation of women and children. I was interrogated many times, but never in that sense mistreated. In about the end of November, beginning of December of 1938, I felt that I had no political or judicial value, and they evacuated me as a prisoner to Valencia, which is at the Mediterranean. And there I was in a Spanish concentration camp, which really was a prisoner camp. Very beautiful weather, pretty liberal, people who had families, I mean, there were only Spaniards, visited at least during the once or twice a week. They could bring their families food, and everybody knew more or less that the Franco government, the fascists, had made, with the help of the Germans and the Italians, so much progress that the end of the Republic was at an end. I was in that camp near Valencia till March of 1939. Then they let people go, because one of the problems was that nobody had food. So I was in Valencia till April 1st, 1939, when Franco was victorious and became the ruler of all Spain, which had been divided into the Republican and fascistic part. I was without any means. When the new regime came, all your money was declared invalid, like in so many upheavals. And at the small hotel where I had stayed, I couldn't be a guest anymore because I had no more money. But they let me eat in the kitchen with the help for a few days. And then I was able to get a pass, which I have here, which shows that I had the permission to go back from Valencia to Madrid, where I was really officially domiciled. Before, in the last days of March, before the Republican government collapsed, my wife, who was in Paris and who had good friends, had tried to get me a permit to leave Valencia with a submarine to France. But as fate sometimes works, by the time the permit was telegraphed to the French consulate in Valencia, the Franco troops had already occupied Valencia, and I never knew about this till later. If the permit to go to France would have arrived a day later, and I would have been able, with a submarine, to go to France, I probably would have been interned a few years later by the French, then Germans, and would have ended up in the gas chambers. So fate or slowness of telegrams has occasionally a value. As I said, I left Valencia for Madrid, I would say middle of April of 1939, with the idea to rebuild or establish our factory, because it was the only, my parents, my brother, in the meantime, my younger brother, who had been in the business with me, in the meantime had emigrated from Germany through Switzerland to Cuba.
Now, what kind of factory is this?
All right, the factory who made cleaning as Productus Salvax. I mean, the word factory is definitely one of the exaggerations of my count. I mean, I was the owner and I was a chemist, and my brother was a salesman, and we had 2 employees. I mean, it was not General Motors. But you can't forget that that was already 1939, after the Crystal Night in Germany. So, I mean, it was all we had. And there was the hope to re-establish a livelihood. So, from, let's say, from May of 1939 on, I tried to re-establish my business and to bring normal order into my life. We had not figured, or nobody knew, that Franco had won this victory with the help of the Germans, and part of the occupation of Spain was the Legion Condor, which was the German expeditionary troop, which also had, through the naturally known Gestapo and so on, police powers. Naturally, there came an edict that in order to have a residence permit, what we would call here a green card, you had to have the guarantee of your consulate. But as a Jew, I couldn't have that. So while I spent much time with procuring letters from people whom I had helped humanitarian-wise during the war, what a good person I was and so on, the Spanish government wasn't very interested in that. They wanted that I procure a, to call it an Wahl of the German consulate, that I was a decent citizen. That for Jews wasn't possible. So in October of 1939, I was detained, this time not by the Red government, but by the fascistic government. And this time I was detained because I didn't have a permit to stay, what we call here a green card. Spain, Franco-Spain being a legal government, had also a habeas corpus. That means you could not be imprisoned for longer than 30 days without getting before a judge. But there was no ordinance which didn't say that after 30 days they couldn't release you and at the same time detain you again. So I was in the Spanish prison, or the Madrid prison of Yeserías from October 1939 to practically June 1940.
On a release?
I mean, I was released every month, and I never got out of that prison. There were no cells. This Yeserías was a former large hospital. There were thousands of prisoners.
Food available? Conditions?
Lousy. Food, yes, I mean, watery soup. No, tremendous overcrowding.
Were you able to buy black market outside?
No, but people from the outside, if you had somebody, were able to bring food in. There were also prison guards who were bribable. But inasmuch as I had nobody, you see, my wife was in Paris. That is 500 miles. But I had some friends who brought me food occasionally. There's one of the funny sides was that when you came to prison, whatever money you had was taken away from you, but kept for you in an open account, so you could use your money. And knowing that, and knowing beforehand that I would be, I mean, the police had told me days ago, we have to detain you because you don't have the card and so. I took practically all the money I had, which wasn't very much. So I had money while I was in Princeton. So I could buy a glass of beer occasionally, but don't forget that at that time the Spanish population was suffering hunger. Even the non-prison population, great hunger. There were rationing cards, which naturally I didn't have. And I have to go a little bit back. Since I was out free in May 1939, we had tried, my wife and I, and I say we, to get together again. The city hall where we got married was bombed out. There were no documents that we were married. I was a prisoner. My wife traveled still on her maiden passport. So we tried with help of friends, and maybe one day she tells her own story, in France, to get a permit to exit France, which in the meantime was in war with Germany. So as a German, it was very difficult from her to get out of France into a European country. But she succeeded and came to Madrid under her maiden name as my fiancé, we would say, and hired a lawyer. She came about April 1940, a few days before my birthday, which is April 24th. And she was an attractive young woman, and she was able to convince the director of Prisiones to let her visit me and give me a kiss through 2 rows of bars. Anyhow, through lawyers and friends, she was able to move more or less freely. She was under surveillance by the Gestapo, and she knew that. She was able to get me out of prison in in May of 1940. Let me also mention that the Catholic priest, or a Catholic priest, came to my wife and told her, "My daughter, we know the trouble you are in. If you want to convert to Catholicism, everything will be straightened out. You can stay in Spain, and you can have leave your business, and you can become a Spanish citizen." And my wife said to him, "We have gotten into this as a Jew, and we will get out of it as a Jew. If we want to convert, this is another story. This is just a highlight. In middle of May of 1940, I was transferred from the College General Prison in Yasarias to the prison in City Hall in Madrid, in their stables, where they usually had the horses and they had the political prisoners there. And I stayed there for about a couple of weeks until we had been able to, or my wife had been able to arrange my expulsion papers. The trouble was that I was expulsed, but we were not married anymore. So when I left the police prison with 2 police detectives to go to the railroad station to be expulsed out of Spain in Sevilla, my wife didn't have a travel permit yet. But in the very last hour, we were able to leave together on the train from Madrid to Sevilla, after we first had invited the few friends we still had at an elegant hotel with always 2 policemen at my side. And it's their favor, I would say, that they had an understanding for our situation while we were traveling first class by train from Madrid to Sevilla. They left us alone and stayed only outside the compartment. We then, in Sevilla, boarded an airplane and flew to Tetuan in Morocco, which is just across the Strait of Gibraltar. And the 2 policemen stayed on the ground and made sure that we didn't deboard again. We arrived in Tetuan I would say beginning of June of 1940, and Tetuan was Spanish Morocco. So we were still halfway under Spanish jurisdiction. We were supposed to leave the next day, or we left the next day by bus for about 20 miles to the border of Tangier. Tangier, at that time, since 1917, the famous Treaty of Algeciras, was a free city, which every so many years was policed by a different power of the Treaty of Algeciras, which was at that time the French. Now, when we came to the border of Tangiers, which was a hut in the no man's land, that border, they said, "I'm sorry, you are Germans. We are in war with you. You can't get into Tangier." we had an Austrian friend of ours with us who had been in prison with me, and he was not involved with, Austria was not involved with France. He could pass. And our suitcases passed, but we didn't. We stayed for 5, 6 hours in the African sun in that hut. We couldn't go back because I was expulsed, and we couldn't go in because they wouldn't let us in. So, I mean, I speak fluently Spanish, and we both speak fairly good French. My wife speaks fluently French. Finally got to convince the police or the border guards that they couldn't let us just in no man's land forever. So there was some phone calls, and then they sent us back on a bus back to Tetuan. And when we came to Tetuan, there was a Moroccan soldier with a big, big gun over his shoulder. And he says, I have to detain you, and I have to bring you to the chief of police. Now, we had been all day practically without food and drink. So I said, look, we are hungry, so can't we go here to a cafe and have a coffee? You can have a coffee too. No, he says, I don't come in with you. I don't want to embarrass you. I wait for you. So at that moment, and after my unsavory experience with prisons, I said to my wife, we don't want to be separated. If they separate us, the first thing we do, we call the rabbi. Can you interrupt a moment, please? So, after that coffee, we went back to our soldier. I said, let's take a taxi. He says, why do you want to take a taxi? We can take a bus. I'm going to stay at the back of the bus. You're not going to escape. You don't have to spend money for a taxi. So we went with the bus to the chief de police, Mr. Buendia, and we walked in there, and the first thing he did, he said to that gendarme, I don't need you anymore. And he made us sit down, and we told him our story. And to make it short, he went to the phone and called the second in charge, Mr. Ben-Dayan, of the Jewish community. And he says, Mr. Ben-Dayan, I have 2 very good friends of mine here. They have problems, and you will have to help them. I'm going to send them to a hotel, and tomorrow morning they're going to come to you, and I'm sure that you don't agree with everything the Spanish authority did, and that you're going to help them. And the Jewish community, Mr. Ben-Dayan, came, and the Jewish community of Tetuan took care of us. We stayed at a very nice hotel, and our problem was that it was illegal to transfer money out of Spain into Tangier. So we had hidden our money in the lining of the suitcases. So our money was in Tangier, and we were in Tangier, in Tetuan. So we were, to a degree, relying on the Jewish community, and tried. My wife had sold the business in Madrid, and the lawyer was supposed to send the money to us. At that time, $15,000, 15,000 pesetas. He's still sending it. And so after a week or so, in the meantime, we had been several times at the chief of police, who always was very friendly in this. Then he says, why don't you take the bus tomorrow and try again? I think that now you won't have any problems. The French government under Pétain had at that time changed. Pétain had capitulated to the Germans. So the chief of police thought that we could get into Tangier. Anyhow, to make it short, we were refused for a second time and came back to Tetuan, again to the chief of police, and I said, look, I have no more money. Oh, he says, here is some money. Took a couple of hundred pesetas out of his pocket and say, you just stay where you are. We will see. Then about a week later, he phoned us and said, tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, you take the first bus. There will be a change. The protectorate of France over Tangier will be taken over by the Spaniards. And with my pass, the Spaniards will let you in. So we arrived on about the 2nd of July in Tangier. We lived in a furnished room at a small hotel. We had some money because the suitcases were there. We didn't have much money, but we had enough money that we didn't have to apply for, how would you call it, public assistance, or for any committees. We were able to, and I tried right away to find some way of making some money, and so did my wife. We were maybe a week in Tangier when this policeman of the Tangier police came and told us to come within a couple of hours to the chief of police. And he says, you came on the 2nd of July, on the 1st of July, when the Spaniards took over, there has been a new ordinance that foreigners who have no visible means have to deposit each, I believe it was 10,000 pesetas. Otherwise, I will have to expulse you again to Spain. You cannot stay. Needless to say that we were, after all these tribulations, rather desperate. And a friend of ours, a leading Jewish European with the famous name of Karl Marx, which has no direct connection with the famous Karl Marx, but his name was Karl Marx, told us we should try, Marion should try to go to one of the Jewish bankers, which I mentioned before, to Mr. Bendrau, and see if he wouldn't loan this money to us as a security deposit. And while this is basically my story, I still want to tell it. My wife, who was always pretty brave, went to Mr. Bendrau and said, Mr. Bendrau, we need this money not for us, but for the government as deposit so that we can stay. And she told the story. And I found out that Mr. Bendrau and a friend of my mother-in-law had done business together in the grain business. And he was very much of a gentleman. And he says, I'm sorry, I am not loaning money to anybody. But don't you worry. Why don't you go home? Everything will smoothen down. So we were rather desperate. We still had 4 days to go. And the next morning, the famous policeman came again and said, you should come to the chief of police. We went to the chief of police and we thought he would tell us he has to expel us. And the chief of police was a military colonel, Don Basilio Sainz de Baranda. And he says, my God, what have you done? You have gone to the king of the Jews. I never would have expelled you. I made a mistake. You didn't come off the 2nd of July. You came already on the 28th of June. So this new edict is not valid for you. The governor called me last night, and he told me that I had made a mistake. So you just go home, and that was the end of that. Then I was able to find a job in a restaurant in Tangier. Marion was able, because she speaks fluently French, her mother was Belgian, to find a job with the only newspaper. There was no telegraph open. That was a war. That was 1940. So in the evening, she took the French newscasts of the radio that was used at the newspaper. In the meantime, I had found a better job, and my boss, which was an Italian nobleman, the Conde de Lettieri, said one day to me, look, your wife is working in Morocco. A wife only can do 3 things. She can be a gouvernante, or she can be a servant or she can be a street walker. But the manager of my restaurant, the wife of the manager of my restaurant cannot work. I said, but we need the money. He says, I realize that. So whatever she makes, I will add to your salary. But your wife is not allowed to work. We lived in Tangier very modestly. We had a 3-room apartment, modern. We subleased 2 of them, so they left us with one room. In November of 1940, there was a political or military situation that Rommel was about to overrun all of Morocco. So there was a danger that the Germans would also overrun Tangier. So while we had lived officially in sin, because we didn't tell anybody that we were married, because for Spain we couldn't, I couldn't say, she couldn't have been together with me. So we decided that we got married. We got married for the second time on November the 1st, 1940, at the Sephardic, under Sephardic rites in Tangier. While we were not or are not religious, you had to marry either before your consulate, which we couldn't, or before the rabbi, who also was the justice of peace. And so out of sentimental reasons, we consider that our real anniversary. In about July of 1940, I was walking in the street and a gentleman approached me and he says, "You are Mr. Wahl?" I said, "Yes." Well, he says, "I'm Mr. Geyer. I'm the American consul. I want you to come tomorrow morning to my office."
Can you stop it?
It was 43. It's my figures get a little bit. We were 4 years in Tangier. It was July of 43 when the consul told us that we should come to his office. When we came there, he says, "I have your American visa." I had become, in the meantime, manager of a very elegant restaurant. We did very poorly as far as monetary is concerned, because the people knew that we had no other place to go, so they paid us accordingly. I worked from at 6 in the morning. I took a little Arab boy and we went to a bakery which did French bread, and we brought to all the small grocery stores, they're called bacals, their order of French bread. Then at 9 o'clock I went to the restaurant and was the manager of the restaurant till 3:30 in the afternoon. Then I went home and slept for an hour. Then I went again at 6 and collected what the bread I had delivered in the morning. Then I went back at 8 and was manager of the restaurant till 12:30. Then My wife usually picked me up, and then we sat on the outdoor cafe for another hour with our friends. To make it short, we got our American visa. We had to get then, it was still World War II, we had to get a Navy cert, which is a permit from the English to travel, so that if our ship was boarded by the English, that we weren't detained as Germans. So into our passport they put a little label, about as big as the nail on my thumb. I made a little sign on there. So if the British would have stopped that Portuguese neutral vessel, they would have known that we had a Navy cert. We also didn't have a passport. We couldn't travel on our German passport. So the Sultan of Morocco issued us a Moroccan passport as stateless. So it was naturally, it sounds shorter now than it was at that time. We then also got permit to fly from Tangier to Portugal, because airplanes didn't exist across the Atlantic at that time. Besides, there was a war going on. So we had to board a Portuguese vessel. So when we came to Portugal, we again had to go through a rigorous interrogation by the Portuguese police. And we were penniless at that time, practically. For almost 4 weeks, guests of the Portuguese Lisbon Jewish community. So we stayed 4 weeks in Lisbon, except of waiting and hoping. We saw the sights. And in November of 1943, we embarked on the Serpa Pinto, a Portuguese freighter, and landed in Philadelphia. We moved to New York. My mother-in-law and my wife's sister, who in the meantime has passed away, lived in New York. My mother-in-law was Belgian, and she had, by birth, she had no problem to immigrate to the United States. So we moved to New York. The first thing I had to do was to go to the draft and register for the draft. But I was what at that time they called limited service, and I decided that I had seen enough of war and that I rather would go into war work, which at the time you had the choice. So I went to the Jewish employment agency. The Hayas had helped us. Hayas had paid our trip, which in the meantime we have paid back. And I said, I need a war job. The only thing I care for is it has to be so essential that I don't have to go into the army anymore. So I found a job with an instrumentation firm whose personal manager was from Germany. And somehow that decided our future. I stayed in New York for this firm for a couple of years, and in 1945 the boss called me in and says, we need urgently somebody in San Francisco. You don't have the knowledge, but the people who have the knowledge don't want to go. You have to decide by the day after tomorrow if you want to go or not. We pay all your expenses. I said, I can't even travel because Germans are not allowed under wartime rules to travel. He says, I'm going to talk to my lawyer. And I still have, not with me, the telegram from the Attorney General of the United States that I can travel by plane with my wife to San Francisco. That was in 45. And since 1945, we live in San Francisco. I have remained in the instrumentation business. The firm I worked for right after the war went into bankruptcy. I then worked for local firms. And the last 25 years, until beginning of this year, we were in business of our own. My wife was the owner, and I worked for her. And we specialize in antique English barometers. We have been the largest dealers in the United States, but by now, as you might realize, I will be 81 next week. We have decided to retire. 10 seconds. My brother Charles left Germany even earlier than we did. He left Germany in 1933. He had been connected as a business student with one of the universities in Berlin, and on April 1st, 1939, when the boycotts came, he decided to leave Germany, went...
Not 39, not 1930.
No, I'm wrong. In 1933. In 1933, he went to Denmark, and from Denmark to Paris, where he became employed by a large group of international department stores worldwide. He was very well-to-do. He had a working permit. In the meantime, he also acquired his student love, a German non-Jewish girl who came in 1936 and followed him, and they were married until he died. But what I wanted to tell is this. While in Paris, my brother collected all, or most all, of the letters which he had received from my parents, who had stayed in Germany, from his brother Max and wife, and from my brother John, who was with the army, who was one of the first soldiers to help liberate the camps. A collection of roughly 500 to 600 letters. There is in our hometown a man, non-Jewish, born after the war, by the name of Föse. Mr. Föse has made it, he is an historian, has made it as his goal to follow the fate of the Jews of Wuppertal. I have helped Mr. Föse contacting people, vouching for him, because I felt, not knowing at that time about the endeavor of this organization, that it was one of the few things you could do as a memorial for our parents. When my brother passed away 2.5 years ago, 3, and 4 years ago, and I came to his memorial in Rochester. My brother converted to Unitarianism. One of the first things my sister-in-law did, she gave me a folder with those 600 letters. And says, these are Jewish letters, I don't want to have any part of it. Mr. Föse, who became a good friend of ours, came maybe 2.5 years ago to San Francisco, and we talked about the letters. And I must admit that I have never read all 600 of them. These letters, he asked me to entrust the letters to him, that he would send them back to me. And some year and a half ago, a book came out in Germany with the title Unter Hakenkreuz and Bombenhagel, which means under the swastika and the hail of bombs. This book was written by a German about the fate of our hometown under that time. And in this book, which is about maybe 150 pages, Mr. Föse wrote an essay dedicated to Marion and myself, and excerpted about 15 or 20 of those letters. And I have I had them, while we don't like to propagate books with swastikas on the cover, I had the thing retyped and excerpt. Unfortunately, it is in German. I have an English version, which a cousin of mine made, but the English is goodwill, not very readable. The letters now, through through friends of friends, the director of the Leo Baeck Museum heard about those letters, and when he was 2 months ago in San Francisco, he induced me to give the full collection to the Leo Baeck Museum. I have a photocopy of it, but that is where the letters are now, which definitely, in my opinion, while many of the things are personal, they show the emotions of my parents. They show also many of the things I told you during the last hour, which we wrote to my brother, or Marion wrote, and it's part of our story, and we are glad that the originals are at the Leo Baeck Museum, which you probably know specializes in collecting the history and culture of the Western Jews, contrary to the Polish and Russian Jews, but specializes in German and Austrian Jews. Go ahead.
I would like to go back a little bit. And when you were in prep school, age 9 to 16,
yeah, okay.
You said that there were minimal Jews in school. So were most of your friends Gentile, or did you run in what I would call a clique?
No, I would say that the relatively few that I didn't run in a clique. The boys I was in class with were non-Jewish. The family friends, the friends of my parents who had children our age, with whom we frequented, or however you want to say it, were Jewish. But there was not too much of a social, like I tried to convey without false pride, because it's 60 years ago. In Germany there was and is a great social snobism.
I understand.
You have that still today.
Right. So that when your parents moved into the larger home, did you have servants?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
And were they non-Jewish? Or
oh yes.
Jewish?
No.
They were non-Jewish?
Non-Jewish.
At any time, did you find later, when you were around 21, were some of these servants still with you?
Yes.
Did you find any antagonism towards you, or?
No, let me answer this briefly. I mentioned in the beginning that the male employees partly became Nazis. Many of the female employees, the sales ladies, who were numerous, were not only loyal to the end, but up to a year ago, that means in 1989, despite the fact that the business of my father had been closed in 34, which is 55 years ago, the former employees met once a year in November. When Marion and I went for the first time to our hometown again, which was in 60 or 61, there were still 40 of the former employees who came to honor us, and the few times we have been back, 3 or 4 times, naturally the 14-year-old girls by now have died off. But even this year I still have letters from former employees. There were also, to go back to the friends, there were Gentile friends who have remained friends till today. Lifelong friends who were friends, where the parents were friends of my parents, where the children or children's children are friends of ours now. Does it answer your question?
Yes. And then in September of 34, you had an automobile, and you seemed to be able to travel very freely. Was there no restrictions that you could pass from border because you were going to France?
No, there was. You mean because of being Jewish?
Yes.
At that very early time of the Hitler regime, there was a monetary restriction. That means when I left Germany in September of 34, if I remember right, I was allowed to take 50 marks with me. I know that when Marion left, a year later or so, she was allowed to take 10 marks with you. But at that time, if you had a German passport, you could travel. There were no, I do not recall if Spain required a visa, but it required a visa for everybody, or for every German. There was no Jewish restrictions.
In other words, you never owned a passport that designated you as a Jew.
I didn't. My wife did.
Your wife did.
Yeah.
And how did your wife survive?
No, you didn't either?
No, I went to the consulate, and they wanted to pay a Jew, and I said, Mary, what was it, Sarah Auerbach?
Yeah.
I said, it's not my middle name. You say Marion Moore, and if you don't want it, I have a policeman downstairs waiting to get me out. I took a policeman around, and they gave me a passport of Marion Auerbach. Never a Jew or nothing. They were afraid they would get into trouble with the French police.
Right.
Yeah. No, I never had. See, I had a German passport, and later on I had none. Then I had a stateless paper from the Spaniards to get into Tangier, and then I had we had our Moroccan passport, which was only good to travel from Tangier to the United States.
Did you...
As a stateless.
Right. Did you have any communication with your parents when they were incarcerated? By them being able to slip out messages to you?
No. Yes, I think we had a... It's not easy to be married.
Can you stop it for a minute?
You see, My father had, right, there were 7 brothers and sisters, but he had 2 brothers, besides the brother I mentioned before who was in Spain. He had 2 brothers in our hometown who married Gentile women, who all through the war and situations were never bothered, neither were the husbands. They survived the war under bad conditions, but they survived and died after the war of old age. So that was one of the communications which were possible. There was also the possibility that we could send, besides we had this famous uncle from Spain who during the Civil War moved to Switzerland, became a resident of Switzerland. He was a journalist and writer. He was one of the friends of the famous Thomas Mann. So that was another connection which we had. But we could send, and we still did send, even from Portugal, packages to Terezin. And there are, among my papers,